The morning sun cast a golden glow across the grounds of Kensington Palace as Prince William adjusted his navy blue suit jacket one final time. Today was different from any other royal engagement he had undertaken in his years of service to the crown. Standing beside him, Catherine smoothed down her elegant cream-colored dress, her hands trembling slightly with nervous energy. They had both slept poorly the night before, their minds racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The couple had received an invitation that touched their hearts in ways no formal state dinner or diplomatic meeting ever could. St. Mary's Children's Hospital had reached out through their charitable foundation, requesting their presence at a special event that would bring together families who had faced unimaginable challenges. These were families who had spent months, sometimes years, watching their children battle serious illnesses with courage that defied their tender ages. William turned to his wife, noticing the way she kept checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. After more than a decade of marriage, he could read her emotions like an open book. Catherine was nervous, but not about the cameras or the crowds that would inevitably gather. She was thinking about the families they would meet, the stories they would hear, and the responsibility they felt to bring comfort in whatever small way they could. Their private secretary, James, appeared in the doorway with a gentle knock. The schedule for the day was carefully planned, but both William and Catherine had insisted on having extra time built in for meaningful conversations. They had learned from previous hospital visits that the most important moments often happened when they strayed from the official itinerary, when they sat down beside a worried parent or knelt to speak with a brave child at eye level. As their car pulled away from Kensington Palace, Catherine reached for William's hand. They drove in comfortable silence through the streets of London, both lost in their own thoughts. William found himself thinking about his mother, Princess Diana, and the way she had approached her charitable work with such genuine warmth and compassion. He had inherited many things from his royal lineage, but perhaps the most valuable gift was understanding the power of simply showing up for people during their darkest hours. The hospital came into view, its modern glass facade gleaming in the morning light. A small crowd had already gathered outside, a mixture of hospital staff, local media, and curious onlookers who had heard about the royal visit. But today felt different from their usual public appearances. There was something more intimate about this gathering, something that spoke to the very heart of why William and Catherine had dedicated so much of their lives to charitable work. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the hospital's chief pediatric oncologist, greeted them at the main entrance. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes that had seen too much suffering, but had never lost their compassion. She had personally treated many of the children they would meet today, and her voice carried a mixture of professional pride and emotional weight as she outlined what they could expect. The couple was introduced to the hospital's newest initiative, a comprehensive support program for families dealing with childhood cancer. It wasn't just about medical treatment, Dr. Mitchell explained as they walked through the corridors decorated with colorful murals painted by former patients. The program recognized that when a child becomes seriously ill, the entire family needs care and support. Their first stop was the Family Support Center, a comfortable space designed to feel more like a living room than a hospital waiting area. Soft couches were arranged in conversation circles, children's artwork covered the walls, and natural light streamed through large windows. It was here that they would meet with several families who had agreed to share their stories. William and Catherine entered the room to find about 20 people waiting for them, adults and children of various ages. The atmosphere was warm, but tinged with an underlying current of shared experience that needed no explanation. These were people who understood each other in ways that outsiders could hardly imagine. The first family they spoke with was the Johnsons, parents of 8-year-old Emma, who had been diagnosed with leukemia 6 months earlier. Emma's mother, Sarah, spoke with the kind of controlled composure that comes from months of having to be strong for everyone else. She described the moment they received the diagnosis, the way their world had shifted completely in the space of a single conversation with a doctor. Emma herself was a bright child with an infectious smile, despite the colorful headscarf covering her bald head. She showed Catherine a drawing she had made of the hospital, complete with stick figures of doctors and nurses whom she had colored in superhero capes. The innocent artistry of a child finding heroes in the midst of her struggle was almost overwhelming in its simple power. William found himself in deep conversation with Emma's father, Mark, who spoke quietly about the challenges of maintaining normalcy for their other children while spending countless hours at the hospital. The man's voice cracked slightly as he described trying to explain to Emma's younger brother why their sister was sick and why Mommy and Daddy seemed so worried all the time. As they moved through the room meeting family after family, both William and Catherine began to feel the emotional weight of the stories they were hearing. Each family had their own version of the same devastating experience, but each had also found their own ways of coping, of finding hope, of supporting each other through the unthinkable. The royal couple listened intently as parents shared their fears, their small victories, their moments of despair, and their reasons for continuing to hope. Children showed them photos and drawings, spoke about their favorite nurses, and asked surprisingly mature questions about why some kids get sick and others don't. By the time they had spent an hour in the family center, both William and Catherine could feel their carefully maintained royal composure beginning to crack around the edges. This wasn't just another charitable appearance or photo opportunity. They were being trusted with the most vulnerable, most precious stories these families had to tell. As they prepared to move to the next part of their visit, the children's ward itself, Catherine paused for a moment in the hallway. William noticed her taking a deep breath, steadying herself for what was to come. They both knew that the hardest part of the day was still ahead of them. The pediatric oncology ward was unlike anywhere William and Catherine had ever visited during their royal duties. The hallway walls were painted in soft pastels, decorated with whimsical characters and inspirational quotes, but beneath the cheerful exterior lay an unmistakable atmosphere of quiet courage. The sound of their footsteps seemed muffled against the polished floors as Dr. Mitchell led them toward the first patient room. Before entering, she paused to explain the protocols. Some children were in isolation due to compromised immune systems. Others were recovering from recent treatments, and a few were in the final stages of their battles. Each situation required sensitivity and understanding that went far beyond typical royal protocol. William and Catherine nodded solemnly, both feeling the weight of responsibility settling on their shoulders. Their first visit was with 12-year-old James Patterson, a boy who had been fighting brain cancer for over a year. His room was filled with get-well cards from his school classmates, photographs of his family dog, and several chess sets. Despite the medical equipment surrounding his bed and the obvious effects of his treatment, James's eyes lit up when he saw the royal couple enter his room. James's parents, David and Linda, had been taking shifts staying with their son around the clock. Linda looked exhausted, her clothes wrinkled from sleeping in hospital chairs, but her face brightened as she stood to greet their unexpected visitors. David remained close to his son's bedside, one protective hand resting on the boy's shoulder. What struck Catherine most was James's immediate concern for others. Instead of talking about his own condition, he asked if they had met Emma downstairs and whether she was feeling better today. He spoke about the other children on the ward with a maturity that seemed heartbreaking in someone so young, referring to them as his hospital family and sharing updates on their various treatments and progress. William found himself drawn into a chess game with James, who, despite his weakened state, proved to be a formidable opponent. As they played, James spoke casually about his treatment schedule, describing chemotherapy sessions and radiation treatments with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had been forced to become an expert in his own medical care. His parents watched from nearby chairs, their faces showing a mixture of pride in their son's resilience and the constant worry that had become their daily companion. The conversation took an unexpectedly profound turn when James looked up from the chessboard and asked William a direct question that caught the prince off guard. He wanted to know if being a prince meant that William never got scared about anything. The honesty of the question, coming from a child who faced genuine fear every day, demanded an equally honest response. William set down his chess piece and looked directly at James. He spoke quietly about his own fears, about losing his mother when he was young, about the responsibilities he felt toward his own children, and about how courage wasn't the absence of fear, but rather doing what needed to be done despite being afraid. James listened intently, nodding with understanding that seemed far beyond his years. Meanwhile, Catherine had moved to sit beside Linda and the two women fell into the kind of deep conversation that happens when one mother recognizes another's pain. Linda spoke about the isolation of having a seriously ill child, how friends sometimes didn't know what to say and gradually stopped calling, how the constant hospital visits had changed every aspect of their family's daily routine. She described the small victories that had become monumental in their new reality. A day without nausea after chemotherapy, a successful scan showing no tumor growth, an afternoon when James had enough energy to play video games with his younger sister during her visit. Catherine listened with complete attention, occasionally reaching out to squeeze Linda's hand when words seemed inadequate. The most difficult moment came when Linda's composure finally cracked. She had been strong for so long, maintaining optimism for her son and trying to support her husband and daughter while managing her own fear and exhaustion. As she spoke about watching James endure painful procedures while trying to comfort other children who were scared, her voice broke and tears began flowing freely. Catherine instinctively moved closer, offering the kind of wordless comfort that needed no royal protocol. In that moment, she wasn't the future Queen of England. She was simply another mother who could imagine the unthinkable pain of watching her child suffer. The two women sat together in silence for several minutes, both crying quietly while William continued his chess game with James, giving them space for their shared grief. From James's room, they moved to visit 10-year-old Amara, a girl who had lost her leg to bone cancer but greeted them with such enthusiasm that the entire room seemed to brighten. Amara had covered her prosthetic leg with colorful stickers and proudly showed them how she had learned to walk again. Her joy was infectious, but her mother's eyes told a different story of sleepless nights and constant worry about her daughter's future. Each room brought new stories, new examples of incredible bravery from children who should have been worrying about homework and playground games instead of medical procedures and uncertain prognoses. The royal couple met teenagers who spoke eloquently about their experiences, helping younger patients adjust to treatment, and organizing fundraising efforts for hospital improvements, even while fighting their own battles. By midday, both William and Catherine were struggling to maintain their professional composure. The accumulated weight of so many stories, so much courage displayed by such young people, and the quiet desperation in their parents' eyes was becoming overwhelming. They had expected to offer comfort and support to others, but instead found themselves profoundly moved and changed by what they were witnessing. During a brief break between visits, they stepped into a quiet alcove where Catherine finally allowed her carefully controlled emotions to surface. Her hands shook as she reached for tissues, and William put his arm around her shoulders, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. Neither spoke for several minutes, both processing what they had experienced and preparing themselves for the remaining visits. Their afternoon would bring them face to face with even more challenging situations, but already they knew this day would mark them both in ways that would last far beyond any newspaper headlines or official reports. They were witnessing resilience and love in its purest forms, and the experience was transforming their understanding of their own roles and responsibilities. The afternoon brought William and Catherine to the hospital's specialized care unit, where the youngest patients were receiving treatment. This section of the ward was designed specifically for toddlers and babies, with rooms decorated in soft colors and filled with age-appropriate toys and comfort items. The atmosphere here carried a different kind of weight, as they prepared to meet families dealing with childhood illness at its most heartbreaking level. Their first visit was with the Morrison family, whose 2-year-old daughter Lily had been diagnosed with a rare form of pediatric cancer just after her first birthday. The little girl was sleeping peacefully in her hospital crib when they entered, surrounded by stuffed animals and family photographs. Her parents, Michael and Jennifer, looked utterly exhausted, their faces showing the strain of months spent, living in a world of medical terminology and constant uncertainty. Jennifer spoke in whispered tones so as not to wake her daughter, explaining how their lives had changed completely since the diagnosis. She described the overwhelming nature of learning about treatment options, making decisions about experimental procedures, and trying to maintain hope while facing statistics that no parent should ever have to hear. Michael stood silently beside his wife, occasionally reaching out to gently stroke his sleeping daughter's hair, Catherine found herself deeply affected by the sight of such a young child connected to medical monitors, her tiny body dwarfed by the hospital equipment designed to keep her comfortable during treatment. As a mother herself, she couldn't help but imagine her own children in similar circumstances, and the thought was almost unbearable. The conversation was interrupted when Lily stirred awake, her large brown eyes focusing slowly on the unfamiliar faces in her room. Despite everything she had endured, she smiled shyly at Catherine and reached out with chubby fingers toward the colorful brooch on the Duchess's dress. Catherine immediately knelt beside the crib, speaking in the gentle voice she used with her own children, and within minutes had coaxed giggles from the little girl. What followed was perhaps the most touching interaction of the entire day. Lily seemed completely unaware of the significance of her visitors, treating Catherine and William like any other friendly adults who had come to play with her. She babbled happily in her mixture of words and sounds, showed them her favorite stuffed elephant, and clapped her hands when William made silly faces to make her laugh. For those precious minutes, the room was filled with the kind of pure joy that only young children can create. Even Michael and Jennifer found themselves smiling genuinely for what felt like the first time in weeks, watching their daughter respond with such delight to their visitors. The medical equipment and hospital setting seemed to fade into the background, as everyone focused on Lily's infectious happiness. But the spell was broken when Lily began to show signs of fatigue, a common effect of her treatment regimen. As she became fussy and reached for her mother, the reality of her situation came rushing back. Jennifer picked up her daughter with practiced ease, holding her close while explaining to their guests that the treatments often left Lily feeling tired and uncomfortable. The next room held an even more challenging situation. 3-year-old Oliver had been fighting leukemia for most of his short life, and his condition had recently taken a turn that left his family facing the possibility that their time together might be limited. His parents, Sarah and Tom, had requested the visit specifically because they wanted their son to experience something special and memorable. Oliver was awake, but clearly weak when they entered his room. He was surrounded by a collection of cars that he moved listlessly around his bedside table, occasionally looking up at his parents with eyes that seemed too knowing for such a young child. Sarah explained that Oliver loved stories about princes and princesses, and that meeting real royalty had been something they had promised him during his more difficult treatment days. William immediately understood the importance of this moment, and began telling Oliver elaborate stories about life in a castle, complete with tales of brave knights and magical adventures. The little boy's face lit up with interest, and he began asking questions about whether there were really dragons and if princes had special powers to help people feel better. Catherine joined the storytelling, weaving in tales of beautiful gardens and friendly animals that lived in the palace grounds. Together, they created an impromptu fairy tale that captured Oliver's complete attention for nearly half an hour. His parents watched with tears in their eyes as their son showed more animation and joy than he had displayed in weeks. The emotional peak of this visit came when Oliver, with the serious expression that sick children often develop, asked William if being a prince meant he could grant wishes. The question hung in the air for a moment, loaded with all the hope and desperation that his parents felt but couldn't voice. William knelt down beside Oliver's bed and spoke carefully about how everyone, not just princes, had the power to bring happiness to others through kindness and love. As they prepared to leave Oliver's room, the little boy reached out and took Catherine's hand, asking in a small voice if she would come back to visit him again. The simple request, asked with such innocent hope, nearly broke her composure completely. She promised him that he would remain in her thoughts and prayers, her voice barely steady as she spoke. The final visit of the afternoon was with 5-year-old Zara, a precocious child who had been receiving treatment for a brain tumor for over 6 months. Unlike the other children they had met, Zara was feeling relatively well that day, and was eager to show off her collection of art supplies and the pictures she had drawn of her hospital experiences. Her artistic interpretations of her medical journey were both heartbreaking and inspiring. She had drawn pictures of doctors as superheroes, nurses as angels, and her fellow patients as brave warriors fighting invisible monsters. Her parents, Anna and Marcus, explained that art had become Zara's way of processing and coping with everything she was experiencing. Zara proudly presented Catherine with a drawing she had made specifically for their visit, a colorful picture, showing a princess and prince visiting children in a castle that looked remarkably like a hospital. The thoughtfulness of the gift and the care Zara had put into creating it was almost overwhelming in its sweetness. As the afternoon visits concluded, both William and Catherine were visibly struggling with their emotions. They had witnessed extraordinary courage from children who were too young to understand why they had to be so brave, and they had seen parental love tested in ways that challenged everything they thought they knew about strength and resilience. The day was far from over, but already it had changed them both in fundamental ways that they were only beginning to understand. The late afternoon brought William and Catherine to the hospital's memorial garden, a peaceful space designed for families to find quiet moments of reflection during their difficult journeys. Dr. Mitchell had suggested this location for their next meeting, explaining that they would be joined by a very special group of people who had specifically requested to share their stories with the royal couple. The garden was beautifully maintained, with winding paths that led through carefully tended flower beds and comfortable benches positioned beneath mature trees. At the center stood a simple stone fountain surrounded by memorial plaques, each one bearing the name of a child who had fought bravely, but ultimately lost their battle with illness. The gentle sound of flowing water created a sense of tranquility that seemed to offer respite from the intense emotions of the hospital wards. Waiting for them on several benches arranged in a semicircle were 8 adults, all of whom had lost children to various forms of pediatric cancer over the past 5 years. They had come together to form a support group that met regularly at the hospital, offering guidance and comfort to families who were just beginning their own devastating journeys. Their faces showed the particular kind of strength that comes from surviving the unthinkable, and their presence in this place spoke to their commitment to honoring their children's memories through service to others. The group's informal leader was Margaret Williams, a woman in her early 50s whose 7-year-old son, David, had passed away 3 years earlier after a 2-year battle with leukemia. She stood as William and Catherine approached, her composure steady, but her eyes revealing the depth of loss she carried. Around her sat other parents, each with their own story of love and loss, each having made the choice to transform their grief into a force for helping others. Margaret began by explaining why they had requested this meeting. She spoke about the importance of sharing their children's stories, not as tales of tragedy, but as celebrations of young lives that had been filled with courage, love, and joy despite their brevity. Each parent, she explained, had something specific they wanted the royal couple to understand about the reality of childhood cancer and its impact on families. The first to speak was Robert Chen, whose 9-year-old daughter Amy had died from a brain tumor after a brave fight that lasted 18 months. Robert's voice was quiet but clear as he described Amy's incredible spirit, her determination to continue attending school as much as possible during her treatment, and her concern for other children in the hospital who were scared or lonely. He spoke about how Amy had started a pen pal program, writing letters to other young patients to encourage them during difficult treatments. Robert reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, explaining that it contained the last letter Amy had written before she became too weak to continue. She had asked him to give it to someone who could help other children like herself, and he felt that William and Catherine might be the right people to carry forward her message of hope and determination. Catherine accepted the letter with trembling hands, understanding the profound trust Robert was placing in her by sharing something so precious. She promised him that Amy's words would not be forgotten, and that they would find a meaningful way to honor her desire to help other children facing similar challenges. The next parent to share was Linda Thompson, whose 4-year-old son, Marcus, had died from a rare form of cancer just 6 months earlier. Linda spoke about the importance of supporting not just the children who are ill, but their siblings who often feel forgotten and confused during the long months of treatment. She described how Marcus's older sister had struggled with feelings of jealousy and guilt, unable to understand why her little brother received so much attention and care while she felt increasingly invisible. Linda had started working with the hospital's family support team to develop programs specifically for siblings, helping them understand their complex emotions and ensuring they received the attention and support they needed during their family's crisis. Her work had already helped dozens of children navigate the difficult experience of having a seriously ill sibling, turning her personal understanding of this challenge into a resource for other families. As each parent spoke, a pattern emerged that revealed the remarkable ways these families had chosen to process their grief. Rather than allowing their losses to embitter them, each had found ways to create meaning from their pain. They had started charities, volunteered at the hospital, advocated for improved research funding, and provided support to families who were walking the same difficult path they had traveled. James Morrison, whose 8-year-old daughter Sophie had died from bone cancer, had become an advocate for improved pain management protocols for children undergoing cancer treatment. He spoke passionately about the need for medical professionals to better understand the unique ways children experience and communicate about pain, and his work had already led to significant improvements in how the hospital approached pediatric comfort care. The most emotional moment came when Patricia Sanders, whose 5-year-old son Alex had died just 2 months earlier, spoke about the immediate aftermath of losing a child. Her grief was still raw and overwhelming, and she struggled to find words adequate to describe the devastation that had consumed her family. But she had come to this meeting because she wanted William and Catherine to understand something crucial about the families they had met earlier that day. Patricia explained that every parent in those hospital rooms was living with the constant awareness that their child's battle might not end in victory. They maintained hope and fought alongside their children with every ounce of strength they possessed, but they also lived with a level of fear that was impossible to fully comprehend, unless experienced firsthand. She wanted the royal couple to understand that their visit, their genuine interest and emotional investment, meant more to these families than any formal protocol could convey. As the conversation continued, William found himself thinking about his own children and the ordinary challenges of parenthood that had seemed significant just that morning. The perspective these parents offered was both humbling and inspiring, revealing depths of human resilience he had never fully appreciated. Their ability to speak about their lost children with love rather than only sadness, and their commitment to helping other families despite their own ongoing grief, demonstrated a kind of courage that transcended anything he had encountered in his royal duties. Catherine was particularly moved by the mothers in the group, recognizing in their faces an echo of her own fierce maternal love, but understanding that theirs had been tested in ways she could barely imagine. Their willingness to share such personal and painful experiences with strangers, even royal strangers, spoke to their deep commitment to ensuring other families would receive better support than what had been available during their own crises. As the afternoon light began to fade, the group began to prepare for the final portion of their visit. But first, Margaret had one more request that would test the emotional reserves of everyone present, including the royal couple who had already been pushed far beyond their comfort zones. Margaret's final request was both simple and profound. She asked William and Catherine to join the group in a moment of silence beside the memorial fountain, where they would honor all the children whose names were engraved on the surrounding plaques. As they moved toward the fountain, she explained that this ritual had become an important part of every support group meeting, a way of ensuring that the children who had lost their battles were never forgotten and that their courage continued to inspire others. The memorial plaques caught the late afternoon sunlight, each one bearing not just a name and dates, but also a brief message from the families about who their children had been in life. Reading these inscriptions, William and Catherine began to understand that they weren't just looking at markers of loss, but celebrations of young lives that had been filled with love, laughter, and extraordinary bravery despite their tragic endings. As they stood in the circle with the bereaved parents, the weight of the entire day seemed to settle upon them. They had spent hours listening to stories of courage and resilience, witnessing the strength of families facing unimaginable challenges. And now they were standing in a place dedicated to children who had fought battles that even adults struggle to comprehend. The silence stretched on, broken only by the gentle sound of the fountain and the distant sounds of the busy hospital beyond the garden walls. It was during this quiet moment that Catherine finally lost her composure completely. The accumulated, emotional impact of everything they had witnessed throughout the day overcame her carefully maintained royal reserve. Tears began flowing freely down her cheeks as she thought about the children they had met, their parents' unwavering love and hope, and the stark reality represented by the memorial plaques surrounding them. William, seeing his wife's distress, felt his own emotional barriers crumbling. He had been struggling all day to maintain the dignified presence expected of his position, but standing in this garden surrounded by evidence of such profound loss and surrounded by parents who had endured the unthinkable, his own tears began to fall. He reached for Catherine's hand and they stood together, no longer trying to hide their emotional response to what they had experienced. The bereaved parents around them understood completely. Margaret stepped forward and gently placed her hand on Catherine's shoulder, offering the kind of comfort that could only come from someone who had walked through the depths of grief and emerged with her capacity for compassion intact. The other parents formed a closer circle around the royal couple, creating a sense of shared humanity that transcended social positions and formal protocols. In that moment, they were simply people united by their love for children and their recognition of how precious and fragile life could be. The royal titles and ceremonial aspects of the visit fell away, leaving only genuine human connection based on shared emotions and understanding. Margaret spoke softly about how their tears honored the children they had met and remembered, explaining that grief shared was grief diminished, and that their emotional response proved they had truly heard the stories that had been entrusted to them. After several minutes, the group began to move back toward the hospital, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. William and Catherine were no longer visitors offering comfort to others. They had become part of a community bound together by shared experience and mutual support. The parents continued to share stories as they walked, but now they also asked about the royal couple's own children, showing genuine interest in their lives as fellow parents, rather than as subjects addressing their future monarchs. Their final stop was the hospital's main auditorium, where a larger gathering was waiting for them. Word of their visit had spread throughout the hospital community, and staff members, volunteers, and additional families had assembled to meet them. The room was filled with people whose lives had been touched by childhood cancer in various ways. From the medical professionals who dedicated their careers to fighting these diseases, to the volunteers who provided comfort and support services, to extended family members who had witnessed the impact of serious childhood illness firsthand. Dr. Mitchell introduced William and Catherine to the crowd, but her words were brief and focused on the genuine connections that had been formed throughout the day rather than formal presentations or prepared remarks. She spoke about how the royal couple had demonstrated the kind of authentic engagement that made real differences in people's lives, showing up not just for photo opportunities but for meaningful human interaction. When William was invited to speak to the assembly, he found himself abandoning any prepared remarks he might have considered. Instead, he spoke from the heart about what the day had taught him and Catherine. He talked about the extraordinary courage they had witnessed from children who faced challenges that would test the strongest adults, and the incredible love and dedication they had observed from parents who refused to give up hope even in the darkest circumstances. His voice cracked with emotion as he described meeting families who had transformed their grief into service to others, turning their personal tragedies into forces for positive change that would benefit countless other families facing similar struggles. He spoke about feeling humbled by the strength and resilience he had witnessed, and about the responsibility he felt to use his platform to bring greater attention and support to the crucial work being done at the hospital. Catherine spoke next, her voice still somewhat unsteady from the emotional intensity of the day. She focused on the mothers she had met, describing their fierce love and unwavering advocacy for their children as inspirational examples of maternal strength. She spoke about the siblings she had encountered, the brothers and sisters who were also affected by childhood cancer in profound ways, and the importance of supporting entire families rather than focusing only on the patients themselves. What struck many people in the audience was how different this royal visit felt from typical ceremonial occasions. Rather than maintaining formal distance and delivering prepared statements, William and Catherine had clearly been genuinely affected by their experiences. They spoke with the kind of emotional authenticity that revealed how deeply they had been moved by the stories they had heard and the people they had met. The response from the audience was equally genuine. There was none of the polite applause that typically accompanies royal presentations. Instead, people responded with the kind of heartfelt appreciation that comes from feeling truly heard and understood. Several hospital staff members spoke briefly about specific improvements and programs that could benefit from increased attention and support, and both William and Catherine took detailed notes, clearly intending to follow up on the suggestions they were hearing. As the formal portion of the gathering concluded, many people approached the royal couple for individual conversations. These interactions continued for well over an hour, with William and Catherine showing no signs of impatience or desire to conclude the visit. They listened intently to personal stories, offered words of encouragement and support, and made commitments to stay informed about ongoing needs and developments at the hospital. As the evening approached and their official visit drew to a close, William and Catherine found themselves reluctant to leave the hospital. The day had transformed from a scheduled royal engagement into something much more personal and meaningful. They had arrived that morning as representatives of the Crown, fulfilling their duties to support worthy causes and bring attention to important issues. They were leaving as changed individuals who had been profoundly affected by the courage, love, and resilience they had witnessed. Dr. Mitchell walked with them toward the hospital's main entrance, but their progress was slow as staff members, families, and even some of the children they had met earlier continued to approach them for final conversations. Each interaction seemed important, and neither William nor Catherine showed any inclination to hurry these spontaneous moments of connection. One particularly moving encounter occurred when Emma, the 8-year-old with leukemia they had met in the family support center that morning, appeared with her parents to say goodbye. She had created a friendship bracelet during the afternoon, weaving together colorful threads in a simple pattern that children her age often made for their closest friends. She shyly presented the bracelet to Catherine, explaining that she wanted her to have something to remember their meeting. Catherine immediately put the bracelet on her wrist, telling Emma that it would remind her every day of Emma's bravery and kindness. The simple gesture, so natural and genuine, represented everything that had made this visit different from typical royal engagements. There were no protocol officers suggesting appropriate responses or time limits for interactions. Instead, there was simply authentic human connection between people who had been brought together by circumstances both tragic and inspiring. As they finally reached the hospital entrance, a small crowd of evening staff members had gathered to see them off. These were the nurses, cleaners, cafeteria workers, and administrative staff who kept the hospital running during all hours, many of whom had not had opportunities to meet the royal visitors during their daytime rounds. William and Catherine took time to speak with as many of these essential workers as possible, recognizing that the hospital's success in caring for seriously ill children depended on every person who contributed to its mission. The car ride back to Kensington Palace was markedly different from their morning journey. Both William and Catherine sat in contemplative silence for much of the trip, each processing the emotional intensity of what they had experienced. Catherine still wore Emma's friendship bracelet, occasionally touching it as if to remind herself that the day's events had been real and not some overwhelming dream. William broke the silence first, his voice quiet and thoughtful as he reflected on the families they had met. He spoke about feeling inadequate in the face of such extraordinary courage, wondering what comfort their presence could possibly offer to people dealing with challenges so far beyond anything he had personally experienced. Catherine nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. They had come to offer support, but felt instead that they had received far more than they had given. The conversation turned to their own children, waiting for them at home with their nannies, blissfully unaware of the harsh realities their parents had witnessed that day. Both William and Catherine found themselves thinking about bedtime routines, school concerns, and ordinary childhood troubles with a completely new perspective. The petty worries that had seemed important that morning now felt almost trivial compared to what the families at the hospital faced every day. As they pulled through the gates of Kensington Palace, Catherine made a decision that surprised even her. She asked their driver to wait, explaining that she needed a few more minutes before she could face returning to normal life. William immediately understood and suggested they walk through the palace gardens, where they could continue processing their emotions in private. The palace grounds at twilight offered a stark contrast to the hospital environment they had left behind. Here, everything was manicured and perfect, designed for beauty rather than healing, intended for ceremony rather than crisis. Walking along the familiar paths where they often brought their own children to play, both William and Catherine found themselves seeing their privileged life through completely different eyes. Catherine spoke about the mothers she had met, particularly Patricia Sanders, whose grief was so raw and overwhelming. She struggled to imagine surviving such a loss, wondering how anyone found the strength to continue living after losing a child. William shared his conversations with the fathers, men who had maintained strength for their families while facing their own terror and helplessness in situations where their ability to protect their children meant nothing against the random cruelty of disease. Their discussion inevitably turned to the practical question of what they could do with the experience they had gained. They had made promises throughout the day, commitments to remember the children they had met, and to use their platform to bring attention to the hospital's needs. But both felt that standard royal patronage and ceremonial support felt insufficient given the depth of what they had witnessed. William talked about wanting to understand the research being conducted, the funding challenges that limited treatment options, and the systemic issues that made childhood cancer such a devastating diagnosis for families. Catherine expressed interest in the support programs for siblings and extended family members, recognizing that serious childhood illness affected entire family systems in ways that weren't always adequately addressed. As they continued walking, they began developing ideas for more meaningful involvement. They discussed the possibility of regular, private visits that wouldn't be publicized or turned into media events. They talked about bringing their own children to meet some of the young patients, feeling that the experience might teach their children important lessons about courage and compassion while providing companionship for children who spent too much time in hospital rooms. The conversation was interrupted when they encountered Maria, one of their household staff, who was walking her small dog through the gardens. Maria immediately began to curtsy and apologize for the intrusion, but Catherine stopped her, asking instead about her dog and engaging in the kind of casual conversation that would have been typical before their hospital visit. But now, even this ordinary interaction felt different. Catherine found herself really listening to Maria's answers, genuinely interested in her life and experiences in ways that reflected the deep human connections she had formed throughout the day. After Maria continued on her way, William and Catherine realized that their hospital visit had changed something fundamental about how they approached their relationships with everyone around them. The artificial barriers of royal protocol seemed less important when compared to the authentic human connections they had experienced with families facing life and death struggles. They eventually made their way back to their residence where their children were already asleep, but their nannies were waiting with the usual reports about homework, meals, and evening activities. Listening to these routine updates, both parents found themselves overwhelmed with gratitude for the ordinary problems and simple joys of healthy children. They spent extra time in each child's bedroom that night, watching them sleep peacefully and feeling a new depth of appreciation for the security and normalcy their family enjoyed. Later that evening, sitting together in their private sitting room, William and Catherine began planning their follow-up to the day's visit. They made lists of the specific families they wanted to stay in touch with, the hospital programs they wanted to support more substantially, and the changes they wanted to advocate for in how society supported families dealing with childhood illness. Catherine pulled out Amy Chen's letter, which Robert had entrusted to her that afternoon. Reading the carefully written words of a 9-year-old girl facing her own mortality, but focused entirely on encouraging other children to stay. Brave and hopeful, both William and Catherine were moved to tears once again. Amy's letter would become the inspiration for several initiatives they would launch in the coming months, programs designed to connect young patients with sources of hope and encouragement during their most difficult times. As they prepared for bed that night, both William and Catherine knew that they had been fundamentally changed by their experience at St. Mary's Children's Hospital. They had witnessed the very best of human nature under the worst possible circumstances, and they had been trusted with stories and experiences that would influence their approach to their royal duties for the rest of their lives. The friendship bracelet Emma had made remained on Catherine's wrist as she fell asleep that night. a tangible reminder of the connections formed and the responsibilities accepted during a day that had started as a royal engagement, but had ended as something much more important, a profound lesson in courage, love, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable challenges. Their tearful moments at the hospital had been captured by photographers, and the images would soon appear in newspapers around the world. But for William and Catherine, the real significance of the day lay not in the public recognition of their emotional response, but in the private commitments they had made to honor the trust placed in them by families who had shared their most precious and painful experiences with strangers who had proven themselves worthy of such confidence.